Okey-dokey. We'll go ahead and get started. Today we are continuing to talk about learning theory, cognitive social learning theory. And we'll continue going on through this lecture and we'll finish this lecture on Monday. So get everything more accessible here. Okay, so we had just been talking about observational learning, right? And we talked about how Bandura was looking at this for therapy, looking at this with the Bobo study. And efficacy expectations are a big part of why observational learning works. So there are four basic types of mechanisms as to why efficacy expectations work in general. All right, there we go. Go away, little bar. Okay. So the first is performance accomplishments. So the ability to carry out the task yourself is a reward in and of itself, right? When you get something, it just feels good, right? So those of you who might be in like a stats or a chemistry class, and you have to work through problems, you might struggle at first, and then you do one right on your own, and you're like, I got this, right? Or you can think about this on the sports field, right? Maybe there's a new skill you're learning, and you nail it, and you're like, yeah, I got this, right? So by changing your performance, you change your own behavior, right? So when you do well, you're like, okay, I'm going to keep doing whatever I just did that worked, right? Vicarious experience is obviously a big part of why operative conditioning and in particular modeling work. So live or symbolic modeling, again, whether we're watching someone directly in front of us, whether we're watching a YouTube video, right? By watching what happens to the model, you yourself are vicariously rewarded. Sometimes it means you will go try the skill yourself, right? But sometimes it means that you just get a good feeling by watching other people do good things, right? Best example of this is watching professional sports. So you're doing nothing. You're usually just sitting on the couch, right? But when your team does well, you feel really good as if you contributed somehow, right? So this is part of vicarious experience. Verbal persuasion includes suggestion, instruction, and interpretations, right? So sometimes along with watching somebody else do a task, they're explaining it too, right? So again, think about like a coach in a sport or a professor in a course, right? Working something out on the board or showing you how to do something. And then emotional arousal. So attribution, symbolic desensitization, symbolic exposure, feeling good, feeling scared, right? Because of something you're watching. These all work by changing these efficacy expectations. So all four of these can lead to a feeling of, I can do this. Rather than, I can't, I'm afraid, I'm not good enough, right? All those types of things that we unfortunately often tell ourselves. So where is the personality in learning, right? It's in a couple different things. So another idea that comes out of observational learning and is indicative of this whole cognitive social learning theory in general is uniqueness. In uniqueness, each of us is unique with regard to a whole host of factors, our circumstances. If we think back to existentialism and the idea of thrownness, right? Each of us are born into different circumstances, right? Unless you have a twin, right? Even you and your siblings were born into different circumstances. Different number of people living in the house, right? maybe more or less lenient parents as you get more and more kids in the house. You know, ability to participate in activities or even attend college. There are also personal factors or person variables. These include our attitudes. These include schema, which are like cognitive shortcuts for us, and include things like self-control strategies. And then also behavioral abnormalities. So if you are someone who maybe isn't that well adapted, that will influence the development of personality and also how we react to things around us and how we react to the circumstances around us. A big piece of what goes into this is what's called reciprocal determinism. And this is the idea that everything in our lives is a reciprocal set of relationships. So if one thing affects the other, then the other is also going to affect that original thing. And don't worry, we have a lot more about reciprocal determinism here. Again, I wish that this would hide. There we go. Okay. So reciprocal determinism basically says everything in our life is a two-way street, that we might think influence is only going in one direction, but in fact, it's always reciprocal. So the environmental contextual here, the top box, is the situation, but it's also the consequences of someone's actions. So it's stressors, it's supports, but it's also those reinforcements and punishments we talked about with our chart on the board on Wednesday. The personal down here is the person. It's their knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, their intentions, and things along those lines. And behavior is what we do, it's our skills, but sometimes it's also problems that manifest in our behavior. So the conditions and relationships are all reciprocally determined. So yes, we know that like the environment affects a person, right? Our personal personality, things along those lines. For example, just like what environment you're in is going to influence the knowledge you have access to. So for example, one of the things they've studied with kids who come from low socioeconomic status is like there are fewer books in the home just because the family can't afford them, right? And we know that having more books and having more books read to you helps with early childhood education. It's nothing against those families. They just simply have to put their resources elsewhere, right? And it's why programs like Dolly Parton's, if people aren't aware of this, she has a great program where kids can get free books from her program. I think until the age of 5 or 6. And she's passed out like millions of books. It's amazing. Dolly Parton was like a secular saint. Like she really does do a lot. Beliefs, right? So how you were raised is going to really affect your beliefs. These might be religious beliefs, right? These might be political beliefs. We know that those often relate, right? Or even your beliefs about your ability to do something, right? If you've always had very supportive parents who are like, yeah, you can do anything you want, that's going to be really different than if you've had folks who always tell you, you're so stupid, you're never going to be able to accomplish anything, right? So yes, your environment is going to affect the personal, but then your personal knowledge, beliefs, attitudes is in turn going to affect the environment, right? So if you come off as very callous, or you blurt things out without thinking about the implications of how other people will respond to them, that can affect how other people are going to react to you. It can even affect your physical environment, right? So if you are a person who's like, we don't need to care about the planet, right? Then you're the person that throws trash on the side of the road and makes the neighborhood not look so great, right? There's a guy in my neighborhood. I live in a very nice neighborhood, but like every day he walks around with those like claw grabbers and a trash bag and he picks up trash. Because even in a really nice neighborhood, unfortunately, there are people who don't care enough not to throw stuff out their windows. And so, yeah, I'll give you an example like how a person's attitudes can affect things. The like worst like discussion-based class experience I've had as a professor is I had a student one time, I was teaching psych of gender, we were talking about mental health, and they said, well, depression and anxiety aren't real, you just need to go out and walk outside. And about 4 or 6, I can't remember the exact number, of my students got up and left the room. And like those were folks I knew who were being treated for depression and anxiety, right? So I had to, in the moment, figure out like, not only how do I help the students who've left and they trickle back in, but how do I like bring this student with that callous attitude in sort of accordance with the rest of the class. So that obviously disrupted the course, disrupted the trust within the course, and so we had to do a lot of working together on it. Now, we obviously know that our personal is going to affect our behavior. Again, if we think, I can do anything, we might try it. Now, sometimes that might not be the best idea, right? If you think, I can do anything, I'm going to go do a double backflip. You might end up with an injury if you don't have training to do that, right? But again, on the flip side, if people have always told you, you're never going to amount to anything, you're never going to accomplish anything, and you've internalized that, that's going to affect your willingness to behave in certain ways as well. Your personal like beliefs will also affect, are you going to phone bank for a candidate? Are you going to get out and vote? I hope everybody is planning to vote. I know everybody's of voting age in this class, so do your civic duty. Some of you may have already voted, I have. Or are you going to be one of the people who like protests in front of Planned Parenthood? Are you going to be one of the people who one day you're a counter protester to the religious people who protested in front of Planned Parenthood, right? Lots of different things that can come into play in terms of behavioral. And then in turn, our attitudes affecting our behavior, like that student speaking out in a very callous way, it's going to affect our environment. Right, and again, sometimes literally, in terms of whether or not we're caring for the buildings and the nature around us. But sometimes just like self-awareness and what we do and things along those lines, right? And then you can imagine these being reciprocal. So let's say I believe I can try new things and probably do well. So my behavior is I'm going to go try those things, right? And then environmentally, maybe, maybe I've gone and I've tried playing soccer for the first time. And I happen to be really good at it, right? The coach might say, hey, have you ever considered playing this, right? So maybe some guy on the sideline coaches, whatever they call small soccer. Little league soccer, that's not right, but you all know what I mean. I did it as a kid, I just can't think of the name. Right, and so then I try that more, so then that'll affect my behavior, and then also my attitudes, like, hey, yeah, I can do this. All right, so it all relates in together, and this is something that when we get into therapies based on this model, we consider in therapy. What are the best ways to start helping people change their behaviors, change their attitudes in ways that will create environments that are more reinforcing for them. Right before I change the slide, I'm just going to take a sec. So it looks like a couple of people signed on a little later, so I just want to make sure I check them off here. I got everybody. Just double check. Yeah. Cool. And if we bounce back to our model that we've been talking about over and over, and we'll continue to talk about over and over, right? We've got our ABC model. So antecedents, behaviors, consequences of those behaviors, again, which might be reinforcement or punishment. And then we've got our P, or our person variable down here. So again, this will keep mapping on. So this makes sense, right? If we're just thinking about an individual, and how they're interacting with the environment. But then, okay, we were just talking about observational learning, right? How does that map onto that? Here's where it gets a little more complicated. You'll see my very high-tech model I believe I made in Microsoft Paint years ago. Woo-hoo-hoo. Hey, it works though. So what happens is you have two people, right? And so in person one, we have what we were just looking at. You've got your antecedents or activating situation. That's going to affect their beliefs, their attitudes. The B here is their behavior. They're going to engage in that modeling behavior, whatever it is, right? Maybe they even use speech to talk about it. And then the C are those consequences. And obviously each of these arrows could be double-sided and it could kind of wrap around, but we're just kind of thinking about this individually, where person one is being observed by person two. They see an activating event. You might not see the person variables, right? They might be more internal, but they see the behavior and they see the consequences. Hey, this person used this particular batting stance and they hit a home run and that won them the big game. And the consequences was they were celebrated for it, right? Then what happens is person one becomes the activating event for person two, for the observer. So person's two's antecedent or activating situation is watching person one. Then they have their person observer characteristics. They have to be open to learning from other people, right? And believing, yeah, I could do what that person did. And then they behave. I'm going to try that batting stance too. And it probably might not work the first time, right? But they work on it. Then eventually they get their consequences, either self-generated or external. Yeah, I did it and I hit it and that's awesome. Or they hit that winning home run in a game and they get the celebration from their team and their coach. Now, one thing that's really interesting about observational learning is sometimes you apply it immediately, right? So if we think about the therapy with snakes, right? They're watching the person interacting with snake and then they try to interact with the snake. Sometimes it kind of like goes in your mind bank for later, right? So you might watch, again, maybe you're watching the World Series, kind of take something in about baseball, and then maybe next summer you're playing baseball and you're like, oh, I'm going to try that, right? And maybe you go back and find a clip and rewatch it. But sometimes this just like kind of goes in your mind bank, your memory for later. And you do something as other people are like, whoa, where'd you learn that? And you're like, oh, I saw someone do it once, right? So what do you learn by observational learning? What do you learn by watching other people's consequences? That's what we call vicarious consequences. You know, that other person being punished or that other person being rewarded. Well, in some ways it's motivational. Why is that other person, your person one, your antecedent, why are they doing what they're doing? Informational is a lot of what I've been focusing on, right? How do I do this? You learn by watching that other person. This just made me think of, so the first time one of our garage door openers battery died, we had to like watch a YouTube video, right? To know how to do it, because every garage door opener is a little different. And this guy that we ended up finding had the simplest video. He's like, this is so easy, my toddler could do it. So then your motivation becomes, well, now I gotta do it because toddlers can do it, right? So sometimes that's going in to it as well. But then he was informational and he showed us exactly how to do it. So emotional as well. So another person in situation A might have had bad things happen. So you can be observationally afraid. This is why we love watching horror movies, right? Because we like being scared, but also knowing we're safe, right? Or maybe the opposite. Maybe someone does something and they seem to enjoy it a lot without any repercussions. So then you try to get the same feeling. And sometimes this is great and no problem, but sometimes this is like drinking a lot of alcohol or using substances that aren't great for you, right? So sometimes it's almost like peer learning. Or maybe you never saw a snake in the wild, but you watched a movie about snakes, a documentary, or I don't know, the classic film Snakes on a Plane, right? And so now you're afraid of snakes, right? That can happen too. A lot of people, when I was growing up, because the original It came out when I was a kid, a lot of folks developed a fear of clowns by watching It, even though they never had a negative experience with a clown, right? Emotional vicarious consequences. And then valuative. This can change your idea of a person. So if you see the model do something and you associate the positive consequences with them, you might be more likely to do it, try it, buy it, right? So this is why we use celebrities and very attractive people in advertisements. Because the idea is, well, I can look like Brad Pitt, Jennifer Garner, whomever, right? If I use this product, right? Or if I have that credit card, right? I can have that too if I do what this famous, attractive, what have you person is doing. This is why Instagram influencers get all the hashtag ads, right? Because the companies know people will buy their products because their favorite influencers are using them. It's also why more and more corporations are starting to do this. I don't know if folks have seen the ads for places as mainstream as like Kohl's that are like influencers talking about, I went to Kohl's and here's my haul, right? And I'm like, it's Kohl's, right? Like, and I love Kohl's. I worked there in high school and college. But it's just sort of like, it's not trendy, right? It's not cool in the same way that some other stores are. So it's sort of interesting to think about. The other thing is influenceability, where you may be just trying to be like someone else. And again, this can be pretty innocuous. It can be, if someone else can do it, then so can I, right? But it can be dangerous if it is, I just saw the musical Mean Girls over the weekend because it was in town. And that's a whole rabbit hole, right? Of like trying to be like someone else and it causing you personal problems and problems for other people around you. All right, what about person variables? Our friend Michelle is going to keep coming back, right? So he has this idea of a personality coefficient. So that's coming up again. We mentioned this during our research on this article. And he says it's about 0.4, which is a small correlation. And then he uses the method that Funder really doesn't like, where you square it, and then you say, okay, so about 16% of the variance is explained by traits. And that means that 84% of the variance is not explained by traits. And again, Funder said, this is not good. This is not a good method statistically. Why are we even squaring it? What does that mean? Right? It's a little arbitrary. But if you remember, Michelle has like this really complex explanation where he claims there's no traits, but then he kind of talks about types having traits, right? Like it's not very clear. And he talks about expectancies and those influencing how we act. So imagine asking somebody out. If you say to yourself, oh, I'm going to ask them out, but they're probably going to say no, right? That's an expectation. And it's how the qualities of a person can influence the impact of various situations. So if you go in and you're like, it's really nice to go out with me, and I really don't want to, right? That person is probably not going to necessarily respond as well as you say, like, hey, would you want to like go grab coffee sometime? Right? So again, self-efficacy is coming into this. So So Skinner would say that behavior is just a function of its consequences, right? Stimulus, reward, stimulus, reward. Bandura would say behavior is a function of expectations and consequences. And Michelle would probably be okay with that. The idea of like expectations and consequences, okay. Again, expectancies, that's cool. Personality traits, not so much apparently. Even though like everybody else is like, Michelle, they exist. And so there are what we would probably call person variables. Those are things that differ between individuals and can also differ within someone's life depending on the situation. And so the competencies that come out of this, that come out of our expectancies, are both behavioral, but also in our brain. They're cognitive. I can do this. So rules are what you have to follow, maybe set by society, or people will set rules for themselves, right? And sometimes these rules make total sense. And sometimes these rules, you're like, how, like, why would you set that for yourself, right? Like, no one can do that. Skills are what you're able to do. And then problem-solving strategies are how you can use your mental abilities in given situations. And as humans, this is really important. As college students, this is really important. This is one of the reasons why we teach you Psych 202 on scientific literacy, right? So a bit more about the expectancies. So there's behavior outcome. This is just pure operant conditioning. You do a certain behavior, you expect a certain outcome. You're a dog, you sit, you shake hands, you expect to get your treat, right? If you're a person and you put in hard work and you're persistent and probably have some ability, you'll get a good grade in Dr. Whoever's class, right? And I know that students share with each other, like, who's more fair than others, because I used to share that with my fellow classmates, right? And then self-behavior, or the self-stimulus efficacy expectations, are about yourself and your own ability to react to a stimulus. I am capable of hard work and persistence. I have some ability as a student. Therefore, I can get a good grade in Dr. Whoever's class. If we ever hire someone named Dr. Whoever, I'll be in trouble. Like, who's on first? I don't know. All right. Stimulus outcome, or sometimes this is called stimulus. This is pure classical conditioning, where essentially you just learn if a stimulus is bad or good. Dr. Whoever rewards students fairly, right? And I hope that most professors are like that. I certainly try to be. So a very extreme example of expectancies is learned helplessness. And this was a theory first developed by Martin Seligman. And now we're going to start getting into the really cognitive part of the cognitive social learning theory. So this is the concept related to the lack of perceived control over life events. So there are some people whose lives have just been so crazy, so out of control, so negative, that they just feel like I can never control anything. Examples like, think about kids who may have been passed from like relative to relative, or had to be in the foster care system, kids who have been abused, right? Things along those lines. And so Seligman showed this through a series of studies with dogs. And so what he did, and this is where I remind you all that I am not an artist. I think I figured out recently the last time I took a visual art class was when I was in 6th grade. So that's about where my ability stops. So just bear with me. That's a dog. Okay, we're just going with ovals being a dog. All right. So we have Opal's the dog. We put this dog, or Sullivan would put this dog, in a experimental container, kind of like a Skinner box, and then would electrify the floor. Not enough to harm the dog in any way, but enough to be unpleasant. Think about like if you shuffled on fuzzy socks during the winter and you touch a doorknob, you're like, "Whoa," that level of shock. And what he did for half the dogs is he built a little wall, and those dogs learned, I can actually get away from the shock. This side is okay if I just hop over that wall. Easy peasy. As soon as there was a shock, they'd hop over it. They'd be good. For the other half of the dogs, he built the wall all the way to the top of the contraption. So they couldn't hop up and get away. And they were not allowed to get away, and they learned there was no escape. There was nothing they could do. A lot of these dogs would just sort of like curl up in a ball. Just makes me really sad. I'm sorry when I hear about it. And then what he would do is he would take that wall out. So they only had the short wall. They would have been able to hop out. But because they learned there's nothing I can do, they wouldn't even try to hop over the short wall. And Seligman said, this is learned helplessness. This happens to people who, again, have horrible circumstances in their lives and learn there's nothing they can do to make them better, right? Again, kids who are in horrible situations, people who are in abusive relationships, things along those lines. And he referred to it as a depressive attributional style. So that people are making internal, stable, and global attributions, and these contribute to a sense of helplessness. So internal attributions would be, these negative outcomes are my fault, right? A lot of people who are abused, their abusers tell them that, right? I wouldn't have to do this if you didn't do X, Y, Z. Stable attributions is believing that's never going to change, that any future negative outcomes you experience will also be your fault. And then global attributions are believing this is going to affect essentially all areas of my life. The negative events will disrupt pretty much all my life's activities. And again, so if you're thinking, I can't do anything about this, it's my fault, nothing will ever get better, and it's going to mess up my whole life, you have a sense of hopelessness, and you may not be able to even like see that there's possible health or possible escape, just like our doggos. So this is a little breakdown of that and how like, so the internal, stable, global, this one's more about anxiety than depression, but gives you a nice indication of it. So if you think this is my fault, it's never going to change, it's going to affect all areas of my life. Let's say you failed a psych test. You think, I have a problem with test anxiety, nothing's going to make that better, I'm just going to fail every class I'm ever in. So maybe you have an internal, stable, specific. And you say, okay, it's just psychology. I'm never going to get psychology, no matter what I do. I'm just going to fail all my classes. I need to switch my major. If you have an internal, unstable, and global, something happened that particular day. I got into an argument with my roommate that threw me off for everything for the rest of the day. Internal, unstable, specific was, on this particular test, I got overwhelmed and I froze when I couldn't answer the first 2 questions, and that's why I failed. Then you might blame everything on not yourself, right? And we all know people like this, who like never take responsibility for anything. In most cases, they're going to be both internal and external factors, right? So if you have an internal, stable, global, you'd be like, written tests are an unfair way to assess knowledge. We should change the system, right? Internal, stable, specific would be, everyone knows that this professor is unfair. This is not Professor whoever, right? They're not fair. External, global, unstable would be, No one does well on tests that are given the day after vacation. That one's probably true, to be perfectly honest. I try not to put tests the day after vacation. But sometimes like the schedule just mandates it. And then external specific unstable would be, oh, I know this person had a book deadline. And they talked about it in class. They probably didn't put a lot of effort into the test, right? And so you can see a lot of these are way more forgiving on yourself than the internal stable global, where you're just like, can't do anything about it, right? Gonna affect my whole life forever. It sucks. And it's my fault, right? Something I can't change. Even though we know that test anxiety is very treatable, right? You might be the dog and not jump over the little hurdle. Now, in terms of thinking about how does this happen, what happens, one of the things that happens is encoding strategies. So people will differ in the ways in which they attend to and organize encoding information. So again, these are back to our person variables. This may be because of how they were taught, right? This may be, maybe they're neurodivergent, or like recently I heard the term neurospicy, and I really like that. So maybe they're neurospicy, and like their mind just processes things in different ways, things along those lines. And schemas, which you'll also hear called schemata. I like schemas better. Schemata sounds a little too like pretentious to me. But these are an organized way of thinking. So it's an organized cluster of attitudes, beliefs, assumptions, which basically mediates between or interprets sensory events, and therefore drives our responses, our behaviors in response, right? Because two people could encounter the exact same situation. We go back to our little chart here, right? You could have two people who failed the same test, and one makes that internal stable global and feels horrible about themselves, and the other person, you know, make one of these external unstable ones and they feel fine, right? Schema are relatively stable and enduring ways in which we perceive and explain and know about the world. So again, it's a cluster of attitudes, beliefs, assumptions, which influences how we're going to interpret things and respond to them. Schema are also mental shortcuts that allow us to process information really quickly. The classic schema example that we often use when we're teaching about this in therapy to our clients is, so when you are very little, you learn that a doggy, and you might say it goggy, right, is something that looks like this. It has 4 legs, it has fur, right? So when you initially start forming the schema, you might think anything with 4 legs and fur is a goggy, right? A horse is a big goggy, right? A hamster is a small goggy. A giraffe is a really tall goggy, I don't know, right? And then you eventually start to refine that schema and realize, no, only certain things are dogs, right? And there are other animals with 4 legs and fur, and so you refine. But if you never refined it, right, you would always think anything with 4 legs and fur was a dog. So some examples, particularly of depressive schema or schemata, are, and these are how a depressed person would react to given situations. So memories. So these are examples of when Dr. Levine was teaching me personality. And so he was talking about, he forgot the handout that day that he was supposed to pass out to us. He said, oh, my memory might be, I forgot the handout that one time. And my generalization might be, I make a mess of everything because I forgot the handout that one time. And my attitudes might be, I'm a failure, I'm worthless. And my premises or beliefs that are driving feeling crappy because I made one mistake might be, I'm never competent at anything. I must be competent at everything in order to be successful. I must never forget anything. Right? Unreasonable expectations, musts and shoulds, if we think back to Karen Horney, right? Not realistic. Right? And so you can imagine if you're always thinking, believing I'm a failure, I'm worthless, like you're just gonna feel worse about yourself, right? And like this is something you ask people about when you're trying to see whether or not they meet a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. And it's like an open-ended question. You'll say, how have you been feeling about yourself? And I would say at least half of the patients with depression I ever treated just spontaneously said worthless. Like I didn't prompt that at all. It's heartbreaking, right? And so specific. And will just paralyze people sometimes and make them feel that they can't do anything right or they can't do anything. All right, so the cognitive part of cognitive social learning theory is really where this theory gets applied into therapy. And this is the type of therapy I have been trained in, and in 2 weeks I will go to a big conference where we talk about cognitive therapy the whole time, basically. And the main idea within cognitive theory that backs up cognitive therapy is that our thoughts, our cognitions, are what causes our negative emotions and other consequences. So it is not the situation. It is instead our thoughts about, our interpretations about the situation. Again, going back a couple slides. All of these folks, right, who might have had these different responses, had the same situation. I failed my psych test today, right? And what cognitive theorists, cognitive therapists say is, it is how you interpret that, it is what you tell yourself about that, that's going to influence your mood, your behavior, how others react to you. So it's our thoughts about the situation. The two main theorists here are Albert Ellis, this guy right here, and Aaron Beck, this guy right here. And unfortunately, they have both since passed away, but very influential psychologists. So Ellis developed rational emotive therapy later in life when it became trendy to add behavioral to any type of therapy. Ellis was like, oh, we've always been talking about behavior. Sure, call it REBT instead of RET. Right? It's rational emotive behavioral therapy. Fine. And then Beck developed, really, he called it just cognitive therapy. Very similar to Ellis. He was like, well, the behavior is like applied. But most of the time we now call it cognitive behavioral therapy. Because we acknowledge that behavior is a big piece of this. All right, so let's start with Ellis because he did start theorizing very slightly before Beck. Beck was a little bit influenced by him. So Ellis was alive from 1913 to 2007. And he studied with Karen Horney. Because like, at this time, you think, okay, so if he was born in 1913, when he was in college, it was like 1933-ish, right? If you want to be a therapist, you were going to be a psychoanalyst. That was kind of like all that was around, right? So because he studied under Karen Horney, she's the one who psychoanalyzed him because psychoanalysts have to be psychoanalyzed. And they eventually had a falling out. But Ellis really took inspiration from a lot of her work and it's incorporated into his theories. He really admired Adler. Ellis was interested in the goals people make. Adler referred to people's goals as fictions. If you think back to our McAdams article about the party we read way at the beginning of the semester, these are the third level traits that McAdams talks about. So in therapy, Adler would really incorporate a lot of elements of both what Adler did, what Horney did, even Freudian ideas about humor. So Ellis told jokes and stories in therapy. He gave homework in between therapy sessions. His analysis at first, because again, if you were doing therapy, you were doing psychoanalysis, right? But it was really problem focused more so than like abstract interpretation, right? In the way that Freud was. It was sort of, how can we get the patient beyond yes, but, right? Very smart patients, when you're trying to work with them, I'll be like, I see what you're saying, but a lot, right? And so it's, you got to kind of work around it. And Ellis really liked Adler's idea of direct problem solving and took that as well. Wolpe implemented systematic desensitization that we talked about when we talked about treatment of snake phobia. Wolpe would use this in the treatment of any kind of phobia, be it claustrophobia, any kind of animal phobia, blood injection injury phobia, that type of thing. And then Eysenck was really a research scientist, but who became one of the first great behavior therapists. Eysenck looked at psychoanalysis and he says, this is not effective or efficient. I don't know that this is actually helping people. And so he looked at research and he said, this is not efficient. This is not effective. And in fact, sometimes psychoanalysis can be harmful to people. And although he was not a great admirer of Carl Rogers, Ellis's therapy really is somewhat humanistic. He did believe in the essential dignity of human beings. So he developed this rational emotive therapy that, as I mentioned, he later changed to the title to rational emotive behavioral therapy. And he argued it's always been behavioral and was just following the trends of people calling cognitive therapy cognitive behavioral therapy. And he founded the Albert Ellis Institute. Ellis at heart really was a clinician. He was much more interested in doing therapy and teaching other people how to do therapy than he was in writing articles about therapy. He wrote a lot of popular books about therapy, but he didn't write as much like peer-reviewed research. And I believe it was every Thursday night, maybe every Friday night. I don't remember the day. It doesn't matter. One night a week at the Albert Ellis Institute, he would have a seminar and have it open to anyone who wanted to come. So any like training therapist who was in the New York area would often come, and you got to see Ellis talk about doing therapy, which is really, really cool. All right, we'll stop there for today, and we'll pick up with more of the details of our EBT on Monday.